Hello, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I want to talk to you about Hytale commands, everything you need to know. So, do you want to add custom commands to your Hytale server? For example, /heal, /teleport, /spawn, or whatever you need, and you might say, yes, but the decompiled code looks very complicated because there are so many base classes. And I mean, you're right, and that's because Hytale has a very powerful command system with argument parsing, with permissions and threading built right in. And today we will learn the system step by step, from your first hello world to advanced patterns like subcommands and variants. So this video covers your first command from like hello world, then we will go into arguments, required argument, optionals, flags, and so on. We will go into permissions and targeting, like who can run what, and I will show you something called Raycast targeting. And we will go into advanced patterns, like subcommands, variants, and other common patterns. And everything you see in this video is hands-on. Every concept comes with working code you can copy and modify, and we will look at it in Hytale itself. If you want to get the source code of this video, just look inside the description. So before we dive in, make sure to join my Discord community. I just started a Discord server for Hytale developers. Make sure to check out my website. Here's also the link for the Discord. And if you want, follow me on Twitter. So let's start with our first command. In this case, we want to build something like /heal from sketch. So we want to type /heal inside the chat and get healed. So let's build that. But first, what even is a command? So at its core, a command is just like a name. So that's what the player types, like /heal, /hello, /give. It's always with a slash in front. And we have an execute method. So what happens when a player types it? So we have a name and an execution method. What happens? For example, send hello world to the player. So that's it. Let's build one. And this is the simplest form of a command in Hytale. So let's break that down. Step one, we have to extend a so-called base class. And in this case, it's abstract async command. So that gives us the structure and the methods and the properties to define commands. Then we need to define a constructor with the name of the command, in this case, hello, and a description, for example, says hello to the player. Then we can override a method from this abstract async command class called execute async. This is our logic, and it's not just called execute, it's called execute async because maybe you saw my last video about the Hytale multi-threading model. We will explain this in a bit, but just be aware, Hytale is multi-threaded, and we will encounter many different places where we need to do like asynchronous programming. So that is like the reason why you see such things like completable future, async, and so on. So, but for now, we just want to override the method. And inside the execute async method, we want to send a message back to whoever ran the command. So we can access a send message method from the object command context, which gets passed as a parameter inside this overridden method. And then we can call something like message.raw. It's like a Hytale specific class to send text. Inside this raw method, we define the string hello world. And then we return something called completable future. Let's break that down in just a bit. But if you take this, it should just work. And that's your first command. It has a name, it has logic, it works. But okay, you might say, hey, you wrote the class, but how does the server know it exists? Like, how can players use /hello? And firstly, you need to register it in your plugin. And once registered, features like tab completion also works, and /help shows it. So you might ask, okay, hey, where do I register it? Is there like some kind of on-enable method? And in Hytale, it's actually called setup. So let me shortly explain the plugin lifecycle. So as a Java plugin, you have different life cycles. And as far as I know, as far as I got it working from decompiling the server classes, you have something like a setup phase. So that's when before assets load. So this is our method we override when we want to register commands, events, and components. And we have something like start. So that triggers after assets are loaded. We can use that to load even more assets, to load data, to start tasks, and so on. So as commands don't need any assets, they're just class definitions, so setup is the right place for that. And Hytale's own plugins do it this way. So we have our main class, like for example, my plugin, which extends Java plugin, which is a class that Hytale server provides. Inside our main class, we have a constructor, we have a method that we override called setup. And inside this setup method, we can access a method called getCommandRegistry. And this command registry gives us a method register command. And inside this register command method, we can instantiate a new hello command object. So now that you know how to register it, let's understand what we wrote. Because what's abstract async command and why do we need completable future? That looks very complicated. So let's go through each part. So abstract async command is the simplest base class for commands. The async part means your code runs on a background thread separate from the game worlds. This is fine for commands that just send messages or do calculations, anything that doesn't need to touch game data directly. Then we have the constructor. The first argument is the command name. That is what players type after the slash. So like /hello. The second argument is a description. It appears when players use /help or like tab completion or so on. And that's all a command needs to exist. The name is how the system finds your command when a player types it. Then we have the command context. And the command context is passed to your execute method. It contains everything about this specific command call, like who ran the command, is it a player or the server console, the raw input string, like for example the full /hello that was typed, and methods to send messages back to whoever ran it. And about message.raw, short German sliver, this is Hytale's way to create text messages. For simple strings, message.raw is all you need. There are fancier options for formatting and colors, but raw covers most cases. So what about completable future void return type and completed future null? So completable future and then in those brackets void is Java's way of saying, hey, this task will complete eventually and it doesn't return anything. And so what does complete future null mean? It means I'm already done right now. You're returning a future that's instantly complete. For now, just always return completable future, completed future null. I know it's a bit of a tongue breaker at the end of your method if you are using like this base abstract command. We'll see why async matters when we cover more advanced patterns. So this is our quick recap. This is our skeleton. We have a base class, we have name and description, we have who ran it, our logic, and like the message, hey, I'm done. That's the skeleton. Every command follows this pattern. Let's see that in production. So here's my main plugin file. I have tutorial commands plugin, which extends Java plugin, and inside the setup method, which I override from Java plugin, I have my command registry, which I just save as a separate variable. And over here in line 56, I call command registry.register command. And inside this method, I pass a new parameter. I instantiate a new object, hello command. And inside this hello command, as you just saw in our slides, I extend abstract async command and I override the execute async method, send a message back to the command context and return completable future, completed future null. So if I open Hytale and I make this bigger and I type in /hello, you can see there are now 4 hello worlds instead of 3. I just tried it out before. I have sadly no /clear, so you can see our command works. And also the cool part is if I use our terminal and I type in hello, you can see it shows hello world in my console, but not in my Hytale chat because we have defined to send the message back to the command sender from command context. So this is like the most basic version of a command. Okay, now we have a simple skeleton. Now, can we do something more useful? So, hello command works, but I want to actually heal the player. Can I just do like player.set health and then 100? And sadly, no. And this is important. In Hytale, there is no player object with a set health method. The data lives inside the entity component system. So like the store and the ref from the previous ECS video, very recommended video, please watch it. And yeah, exactly. To change a player's health, you need to get their so-called health component from the entity store. But abstract async command doesn't give you store access. So how do I get it, you might ask? There's a different base class for that. It's called abstract player command. It gives you everything you need. So when you extend abstract player command, your execute method gets many more parameters. We get the command context, which we had before. We get the entity store, which is important for our data access. We get our entity in the ECS. We get the player ref for sending messages, like getting the name and so on. And we get the world we are in. So the base class abstract player command gives you store and ref automatically. You don't fetch them yourself. So why does it give me all that? Why can't I just get the store myself? And the answer is threading. Each world in Hytale runs on its own thread. You can only safely access the store from its world's thread. And abstract player command handles that, and yes, it does. It makes sure your execute runs on the right thread. The threading video explains this in detail. Here, you just need to know, use the store you're given, and it's safe. So let's build /heal. Our plan is to extend abstract player command, get the player's health component from the store, set it to maximum. That's the most simple version of a heal command. So, step 1. We define a new class called heal command, which extends abstract player command, not abstract async command. Then, almost the same as before, we have a constructor, which defines the name of the command and a description. Then we override the execute method, and now it's called execute, not execute async. We take in all our parameters we get from this abstract player command, so please take a note at the different method signature. And now we get to the more specific details of the entity component system inside Hytale. So we need to get something from the store called the entity stat map. So this is the component which holds all the stats for an entity, like health, for example. We pass in the ref, like the reference to the entity, and we say, hey, we want to get this specific component type. So now we need to get the so-called index from the stat map for the health values, and then we can get a specific entity stat value object. In this case, we call stats.get and like take the health index. There's like a different reason for it to be like this specific data structure. When we have got the health, we can calculate the missing health with the method getMax, which means, hey, what is the maximum amount of health this entity can have? And what's the current amount of the health which the entity has? And then we can say, hey, stats.add stat value, add it to the health index and add the missing amount. And this is then completed by a send message to the player ref itself, healed to full health. So this is all we need, so let's try it out. Back again in IntelliJ, I have my command registry and I define a new heal command. And in this case, I changed the method name to custom heal in order not to override any methods that Hytale itself might define. We extend abstract player command. We have our overridden method called execute. And I added a null check here to check, hey, does this entity have this specific stats component? Because it can be null. So you always have to add those null checks. Then I get the index from this static method here, which just defines all the indices for the different type of entity stats. So we also have health, oxygen, stamina, mana, and so on and so forth. I also add a null check here again in order, like if we can't find a health stat. This can happen if like an entity has an entity stat map but doesn't have health, for example. But then it's just like as the slides, I calculate how much health is missing and heal to max, and I send feedback to the player. So if I open Hytale and I make it a little bit brighter and I type in /custom heal, it's not found because I haven't restarted my server yet. Wait a minute. Okay, the server is restarted. Let's type in /custom heal, and there it says heal to full health. So in order to show that, let's switch to adventure mode. I got some damage. I type in /custom heal, and there I go. I just went to full health. Nice. Okay, and hey, you just modified the entity component system data through a command, and this is one of the core patterns for most gameplay commands. So what we learned so far, we have a class called abstract async command. We only get command context, and this is useful when we need to display messages or infos or don't really need to access data. But if we want to access the store or the ref or the player ref or the world, or modifying any of your own data, we need to use abstract player command. So pick a base class based on what you need access to. The base class handles threading for you, in this case, abstract player command. But wait, so this heals me, but what if I want to heal someone else, like /heal Steve? And that is a very good question, and for that you need arguments, a way to pass data like player names into your command. So let's dive into part 2, arguments, making commands flexible. So what is an argument? An argument is a named parameter that players pass to your command. Like for example, with /heal Steve, the argument would be the player name. When we have a command /give Steve diamond sword 5, we would have 3 arguments. We would have the player name, the item, and the amount. So in Hytale, arguments are defined with a name, so how you access the value in code. We have a so-called archetype, argument type, which says what kind of value it is, and we can define if it's required or optional. So we have required arguments, which what the name implies are required. On the other hand, we have optional arguments, which don't need to be passed, but they can be used if a player types them in. And we have flag arguments. So if you just want a simple Boolean switch. So required arguments must be provided. Optional arguments can have defaults, and flags are Boolean switches. So this is like the very basic way of defining arguments. We define arguments in our commands constructor. So inside, for example, our heal player command, we define a property called private final default arg, and then we pass in the data class we want to save it as, in this case integer with a big I. And inside the constructor, we can initialize this class property with the method with default arg and provide it name, a description, a type, a default value, and a default description for /help. So we can do this with the different argument types. We are provided with the method with required arg. We are provided with optional arg and with default arg. Or, for example, with flag arg. And now inside our execute method, we can access those argument values based on the get method. So, for example, we want to get an argument called amount. We call it amount arg.get context. And you may saw, okay, you saw the box parameter. In this case, I used the primitive data type, so you can use both things. Be aware that get context returns the correct type automatically. You don't need to do any casting. So, okay, I can define arguments, but for /heal Steve, how does the command know that Steve is a player and not just a random string? And that's the job of archetypes. They parse the input string into the correct Java type. So archetypes.string gives me a string, you might say, but there's something that gives me a player, and yeah, exactly. It's called archetypes.player_ref, which parses Steve into a player ref. It also handles validation. If Steve isn't online, the command fails with an error message automatically. So archetypes convert strings to Java types. They also provide something like fuzzy matching, they provide validation, and they provide type safety. So a very well thought out architecture. There are many different archetypes. Here are the most common ones you may work with, like string, integer, float, boolean. We have something called a player ref, we have a block position, and we can also define a reference to assets. So archetypes are static fields, not methods. There are many more for entities, worlds, colors, so please check the archetypes class for the full list. But now we get a new problem. So I can get a player ref for Steve, but in part 1 we needed star and ref to change health. So player ref isn't the same as just ref, right? And it's a little bit confusing, but you are correct. Like player ref lets you send messages and get the player's name. It's in the hierarchy of Hytale's multi-threading architecture above the entity component system. But to modify ECS data, you need the actual entity ref. So how do I get not my own entity ref, but Steve's entity ref? And yeah, you might wonder, but yeah, there's also a base class for that. Abstract target player command, it's called. Instead of giving you your ref, it gives you the target's ref, the player specified by an argument. So remember abstract player command from part 1, which gives us our own ref. Abstract target player command is similar, but for a target player. So the base class handles finding the player, getting their ref, and running your code on the correct world thread. So let's build a command that heals another player. So first things first, we need to define a new class and extend abstract target player command. Then business as usual, we override the execute method, but in this specific case, it receives the target's ref. Now we can do the same logic we used before for our entity step map and so on, but in this case it doesn't get applied to our own ref, it gets applied to the target's ref. So how does it know the target? Because you might say, hey, I didn't define a player argument. How does the command know who to heal? And abstract target player command automatically adds a player argument. You use it with like heal player -- player Steve. And can't I just type heal player Steve without the player? And the sad thing is not with this base class, or at least it's not the way I figured it out. Maybe in the comments you have a different solution for that, because it uses a so-called named argument. But you can build commands with positional arguments too. We will cover that difference next. So Hytale has two ways to pass arguments. We can use positional arguments, which is just the value, like for example /teleport Steve, which you might know from games like Minecraft, and we have named arguments, -- name and then the value, like /heal -- player Steve. In the first line, we have positional arguments, which are required because they are parsed from left to right. And in this case, we don't need the syntax which defines the parameter because it's parsed left to right. We expect it to be typed in a specific order. But named arguments can be optional. So it doesn't matter in which sequence they are typed inside the command. So there are like two ways to approach commands in Hytale. And abstract target player command uses named arguments for flexibility. If you want shorter syntax like /heal Steve, you can build your own command with positional arguments. So here are those commands side by side. On the left, we have a abstract target player command, which automatically handles everything and adds the argument. And on the right side, we have the positional type of argument, which defines a required arg, initializes it in a constructor, and then inside the execute async method, we need to get the ref manually. We need to ensure that we execute it in the correct world thread and so on. So it's a little bit more work we need to do ourselves. So it's just like a trade-off of what you want. Do you want to do the thread handling automatically, or are there even cases where you want to handle it yourself? Do you want to fetch the refs manually because you have like some more complex logic you want to do? Is like the order of the command something that matters to you? Then you can either use the one or the other. Like the typical recommendation is like to use abstract target player command for most cases, because the player syntax is explicit and the base class handles all the complexity. Only use like positional commands if shorter syntax is critical. And this is because remember from part 1, each world runs on its own thread. So to modify Steve's health, your code must run on Steve's world thread. So abstract target player command does that for you, and with positional arguments, we need to schedule it. So get the target world, and inside the target world, execute the methods for get reference and get store inside the Lambda function, and now we are safe. So if we go back to abstract target player command, this is everything we need to define, and it should work, so let's try it out. Okay, so let's head back to IntelliJ. I have here my command registry with my heal player command, and in this case I also added like a optional argument which can define the amount, for example. And here is exactly the same code as before with the null checks and so on. And I go into Hytale itself, and for example, I type in /heal player -- player, and I type in my name, and then it says, hey, you have been healed. But if I type in a name of a player that isn't online, it says, hey, no such player as their trouble. And if I type in just heal player, then it goes back to my player reference because it takes this as the default. And if I type in /heal player -- help, it shows me the optional arguments, which we come to in just a second, and the argument types. In this type, for example, the archetype player, and shows us how to use that. Okay, so we pick the base class based on who we want to affect, like abstract player command yourself and abstract target player command another player, but because of the default workings of that base class, it also affects us. So what if we want to heal a specific amount, not just to max? We can add an optional argument, initialize it in the constructor, and inside the execute method, the argument is null if it's not provided. So in this case, we can add a simple null check. Hey, if amount isn't provided, or in other words, if amount is null, then just heal to the max. And if it is provided, then just pass it to the add_stat value inside the amount. So that is how we would do optional arguments. So this is then like the example usage of this command. And be aware that stat values are always clamped between min and max. So I can type in 1000 to heal it to 1000, but it just gets clamped. That's like the word meaning to like we can't overheal or go below 0. So this is like very specific for entity stat map. Okay, so what have we learned? We have learned the with required arguments to define a positional argument. We can use optional arguments, which return null if they are not provided. We can use default arguments, which are optional with a default value. We can use the with flag argument to define a Boolean switch. We have different argument types to pass strings to Java types. And we can use the get method from the argument to read the actual argument values. So the pattern is straightforward. We just define arguments in the constructor with the argument method of our choice, define it in a class, read them in execute, and get them with arg.get. But wait, like this is great for targeting players by name. But what if I want to heal whatever I'm looking at, like any specific entity, like point at a mob and heal it? And that's called Raycast targeting. This means like the command finds what's in your crosshair. And yes, there is another base class for that. It's called abstract target entity command. So before we can do that, let's go into targeting and permissions. But let's talk about permissions first. So a little bit of a cliffhanger here. So let's say your heal command works, but you don't want regular players to use it, only admins. And that's what permissions are for. So let's cover that first and then Raycast. So a permission controls who can run a command. We can define a permission inside the constructor of our command itself. So if a player without the permission try/heal, they get an error message automatically. You don't need to check manually. And that's a very, very elegant design of the Hytale API with this Hytale permissions class. And it also automatically defines a prefix for your permissions. So, for example, if a player types in /heal, Hytale checks, hey, does the player have the heal permission? If yes, run execute. If no, say, hey, you don't have permissions. And permissions are typically granted through ranks, roles, or permission plugins or mods. The command just declares what it needs. And Hytale uses a hierarchical naming convention. So if we have a simple permission with the method require permission and then pass in Hytale permissions.from command, and then type in heal as a parameter, it generates the string command.heal. This is what we would need to type into our permissions config. And we can also define sub-permissions, which gets nested, like command heal self, command heal other. You can also use, you should use descriptive names. So heal.other is clearer than just heal2. Admins can then grant command.heal.star for all heal permissions, for example. And sometimes you may need multiple conditions. So player need both permissions in order to call this command. So you can just chain your require permissions calls, or, which is also quite elegant, you can use more complex permission rules for complex logic. So you can bind them with an or, where you can say, okay, the player needs the heal permission or the super admin permission. So like one of those permissions. And that's like a very basic introduction to permissions. So, okay, I add require permission in the constructor and Hytale handles the rest. And yes, it's exactly how that works. So now let's talk about targeting. You wanted to heal what you're looking at, right? Yes, I wanted to do that. Instead of typing a name, just point at something and heal. And that's what abstract target entity command does. It uses a so-called Raycast to find the entity in your crosshair. So a Raycast shoots an invisible line from your eyes in the direction you're looking. So if a player is looking at a zombie, the Raycast hits the zombie and that's our target. And Raycasts can hit players, mobs, NPCs, basically any entity. They can also hit blocks, but abstract target entity command focuses on entities. So similar to the abstract target player command, but with target player, we target players only. With target entity, we target any entity. The selection is either with the player argument or with the crosshair, and we get a player's ref or an entity's ref. And this is how that would look. It's basically the same build-up, just like another abstract target entity command, which we extend our base class. So let's build /heal entity. And we start with defining the class. We continue with overriding the method. We get the target's ref. And then we go just ahead. And that's the beauty of the entity component system. It's now the third time we have reused our code. We get the entity stat map for this specific entity ref. We get the health index. We get the value. We add the stat value, and then we send context.sendMessage, because remember, the command context sends the message to the command sender, and then it should work. So let's take a look. So if I look at nothing and type in /heal entity, it should say to me, no entity in view. But let's go to an entity which should stay at a given point. So this sheep, for example, no, it runs away. Okay, the zombie. Let's hit it, and /heal entity. And then it said entity healed. So now it should be back to full health, but sadly I can't look at how much health it currently has, but I can still type in /heal for myself, or /custom heal, this was the implemented command, and /heal entity to heal this zombie again. And this should work for every entity you would see. And now we can kill it. Okay, I admit it was a little bit hectic. But now regarding the targeting of players, entities, and commands, those are the base classes when you want to target yourself, another player, or any entity inside your crosshair. So pick the base class based on who or what you want to affect. The base class handles the complexity. There is one more thing I want to talk about with you, and those are validators. So what if someone types /heal amount and then -100? That would damage instead of heal. Like it wouldn't because of clamping, but what if someone does that? And that's a good catch, because we need to validate the inputs, and Hytale has built-in validators for that. So you might ask, okay, do I check the value inside my execute method? And yes, you can, but it's better to validate at the argument level. Invalid input gets rejected before your code even runs. And note, stats values like health are automatically clamped to min-max, but validators catch bad input before processing, before any processing. So it's useful for any argument and not just stats. So validators check arguments values before your execute methods run. Inside our constructor, where we define our arguments, we can call the methods addValidator, and we can chain them and add different validators like greater than or less than or equal. And then it automatically provides us with error messages if we call it with the wrong amounts. So validation errors are shown to the player automatically, which means clean input and clean code. There are many common validators. For example, greater than, which takes a number as an input to say, for example, it must be greater than 0. We can also say less than or equal. For example, must be less than or equal to 100. We can say it must be a non-empty string, so strings can't be blank. Or, and that is also very powerful, we can provide our own custom logic. For example, we can say, hey, yeah, you are allowed to heal, but we only accept even numbers, and then we can return a validation result error or a validation result success. So this is how an example would look like. Inside the heal command, we have our optional argument, and inside the constructor, we add our validator. So here's our property, and here's our validator. And inside the addValidator, I have my custom logic that says, hey, the value should not be null, and it should not be less than or equal to 0. Or basically said, okay, I want to throw an error if the amount is not positive. So null would mean heal to max, and the validator allows null or positive values, rejecting 0 and negative. Let's look at that inside our heal player command. I have used the standard implementation of addValidator, which says, okay, the argument amount must be greater than 0. And if I go into my game and type in /heal player, -- player bytes, and then type in -- amount and then -5, it should say, yep, fail must be greater than 0. And if I type in 10, it says you have been healed. So let's quickly summarize what we have learned. So we have learned the concept of require permission, which controls who can run a command. We know that we use the class Hytale permissions and then the method from command to create permissions from a name. We can use permission rules with methods like or and to use complex permission logic. We have a base class called abstract target entity command to target an entity via Raycast. We can use the addValidator chains on arguments to validate argument values. And we have built-in validators like greater than or non-empty string, for which we can use it for our commands. So we have permissions at command level, validation at argument level. Both are checked before your code runs. But wait, let's say I have a bunch of related commands like world create, world delete, world list. Do I need to make 3 separate commands? And you could, but there is a better way. Subcommands. You can group them under /world with a so-called abstract command collection. So let's dive into more advanced patterns with subcommands, variants, and their registration. So a command collection is a parent command that contains subcommands. Like for example, we have /world, which is our parent command, and it contains subcommands like create, delete, list, or teleport. And the parent /world doesn't do anything itself, it just organizes its children. So let's look at how this works. At first, we create our class world command, but now we extend a class abstract command collection. We define, as we did previously with the constructor, our command name and the command description. But now inside the constructor, we add the method add subcommand, and there we can define the new instances of our other commands. Like we define new classes world create, world delete, world list command. And I will show it to you as a subcommand as an inner class, but you can also define it in a new file. So for example, inside world command, I can define a inner class world create command, which now extends abstract async command, but it also could extend abstract player command. I give it also a name and description over the constructor and override the execute method. And that's everything I need for a command collection to register it to the parent command. So this is like how it would look implemented. It's a little bit small, I know. I have like a world command, which is the parent. I define two static inner classes, but you can also define them in separate files. And I just do like some placeholder things in the execute methods where I send a message back to the sender, which would hypothetically create the world we want to create. But in this case, I just want you to show the command collection. So with this pattern, we should be able to use the different commands inside Hytale. So let's try that out. Back into Hytale, I type in /worlds. And as you can see, it gives me an overview of how to use my parent command. So it says to me, okay, you have /world and then a subcommands list, create and info. And it also shows me the parameters I have defined before. So /world list gives me the list of worlds. /world create, I can also use the -- help flag over there. And then it says to me, okay, you need a text argument and this is how you would use it. So I would say world create new world, and it obviously doesn't create a new world, but the command worked because it said, hey, world create world, blah, blah, blah. Actual world creation requires world generator setup. Or I will type in world info, and then it says, hey, wait a minute, you provided the wrong number of required arguments that was specified. I expected 1, but you provided 0. So I would say world info default, and it, for example, gives me the player count. So this is how I have implemented it inside IntelliJ. So here's my command registry with register command. I have the world command, which extends an abstract command collection. I have my subcommands, and now inside the class, to like just save on some files, I have my world list command, which in this case actually goes through all the worlds. I can get the worlds through universe.get, which is like a singleton class to get the universe, which contains the worlds, and then I can get the values. Wow. And then I can say, for example, okay, is the collection empty? If so, no worlds are loaded. Or I will concatenate all the worlds with a string builder and send it out back to the command sender. And in this case, for the world create command, I have just implemented this simple context send message. And for world info, I have implemented the same thing as with list. I get the world from the universe. I check if the world is null. If so, say, okay, this command ends here. Then I build a new string and I say, hey, I append players and get from the world object the get player refs and then the size. So this is also like a collection of player refs inside this world. And then I can get the size of the collection, which means, hey, how many players are in this world? And then I send it back to the command sender, which also should work with the console. So if I open world list, it shows me the world list, and world info default, it shows me players 1. Great, so that worked. We can also do nested subcommands. We can nest collections inside collections. So that's also a very, very pragmatic pattern of Hytale. Inside, for example, our admin command class, which would be an abstract command collection, we can define another collection and another collection and another collection. But I think 3 hierarchies would be enough. So let's move on to another very powerful pattern inside the commands API of Hytale. That's called command variants. So what if I want a command like /give diamond to give to myself, but /give Steve diamond to give to someone else? Like same command, but different signatures. And that's a so-called command variant. one command name, but multiple ways to call it. So not really subcommands, but different argument patterns, you would say. And yeah, that's exactly right. You use add usage variant to add alternative signatures. But there's a very critical rule you need to know. So how do variants work? Hytale dispatches to variants based on number of required arguments. So if a player types in /give diamond, it's one required argument. But if a player types in /give Steve diamond, those are two required arguments, which is a variant. So the first one is the main command, and the second one would be the variant. Each variant must have a different number of required arguments. Two variants with the same count will crash the server. A variant is different from an alias, so which also exists in Hytale. We are using variants. So can I use abstract target player command for the variant? It adds player automatically. And that's exactly the trap you would run into. Abstract target player command adds a player argument as an optional argument, not required, because my heal player command worked without providing the player argument. Then it just healed myself. So both would have the same number of required arguments. And yes, that's exactly the implication, because we have our main command, which have one required argument, the item, and then we would have the variant, which would also have one required argument, the item, because player is optional. So same count results to a conflict, results to a crash. So the correct pattern would be to define the command, for example, give, then we say the required arguments. Whoops, no, I jumped again. Then we define the add usage variant to new give other command, and inside give other command, now we can define something with the arguments we want to do. So in give other command, we have two required arguments, which is different from the main one. So this is how you would use it. We have the top command, which is the main command, which has one argument, and we have the bottom command, which has two arguments. I know it's a little bit rushed and it's a little bit complex, so let's just go straight ahead into IntelliJ and look at the source code. So I have here my custom give command, and I just want to give items players and give them to myself and give them to another player. So I have a required positional argument for item name. So I say, hey, I have a required argument called item argument. And then I have an optional argument for the amount. So this is my main command, custom give command, and I initialize it inside the constructor. So I say, hey, this argument is required. It is an item and the item to give. For example, the diamond sword. In this case, I just called it archetypes string. And then I give it an amount argument, which is optional, which defines the amount to give. And I say, hey, it should be greater than 0, but it should at max be 64. So this is my main command. And this is the execute method of our custom give command. So I get the item arg, I get the amount argument, I check if the argument is set, if not, default to 1. And like in a real implementation, we would now look up the item asset map, we would get the player's inventory component and add the item to the inventory. In this case, I just simulate it and give it to the player ref. And now inside the constructor, I can define an usage variant. So I define add usage variant, which is a method which is provided by abstract player command, and I define new give other command. And over there, I have now my new class called give other command, which defines 3 arguments, or 2 required arguments, which is player args and item arg. We don't use abstract player command. We use abstract async command because we need player to be required. I don't give it a name. I only give it a description because variants use a description only constructor, because the variant just interferes with the arguments, but not with the name, because the name is given by custom give here at the top. I define everything as I want it to be, like with the arguments and so on. And now I implement the business logic we want for our custom give variant. So in this case, get the target player, then get the item, get the amount, and do the defaults. And we could also extract those into common base methods to not duplicate logic. But in this case, I only wanted to highlight the usage of command variants. We can also add a command alias, which works by, if I type in control and press the space key, add aliases, I can define a list of aliases, like for example, GV or trouble give. And now I could call the custom give command, with custom give, or with GV, or with trouble give, for example. Oh, sorry, I don't know why I have so many trouble speaking right now. So this is also very powerful if you want a shorthand syntax for the base command. Okay, let's try it out. If I type in /custom give and then, for example, cobblestone, it gives me 1 cobblestone. If I say with amount 2, it gave myself 2 cobblestone. But if I say custom give cobblestone, it says no such player cobblestone. But if I say custom give bytes cobblestone, it gave 1 cobblestone to bytes, which is in this case myself. Or I can say amount 64, and then it would hypothetically give me 64 cobblestone. And we could also use trouble give, for example, with the exact same arguments. So let's look at a quick summary. So variant rules. If we have different required argument counts, this is a rule because the dispatch is based on count. We use description-only constructors because the name is defined from the main command. We don't use abstract target player command because --player as an argument is optional and it doesn't add to count. We use abstract async command or everything other that gives us full control over required versus optional parameters, or that's at least what I found out. So the main command has n required arguments. The variant needs to has n+1 or different n. Never, never, never the same count. And then we have the difference between variants and subcommands. So the syntax of subcommands is, for example, /world create, and variants are like /give item or /give player item. So the purpose of subcommands are different actions, whereas in variants we want, for example, the same action but for different targets. We use different classes and we dispatch them either by the subcommand name or by the required arguments count. So if we have different verbs, we would use subcommands. If we have the same verb and different targets, we would use variants. So for the last bit of this video, let's look at some patterns used in real Hytale commands. So Hytale has built-in confirmation for destructive commands. So you may have noticed that if you want to initialize in a constructor a command, for example, you have 3 parameters: the name, the description, and a Boolean flag called requires confirmation. And this will result in the command to only run if --confirm was provided, which is very important for destructive commands. So if I type in /world delete my world, then it says, hey, this command requires confirmation, add --confirm to proceed. And only if I provide it to the command, it's going to execute the logic. So the third constructor parameter true automatically adds a confirm flag and blocks execution with it, and the default value should be false. We can also use default arguments with computed values. So we have default arguments, which is like optional argument, but we compute the default at runtime. So we could say, for example, we have an argument for a player ref, and we say, okay, the default value should be the sender as player from the command context, and we get the context inside this lambda expression from default argument. So this is very, very useful when the default depends on the context. Like, for example, hey, default to yourself. We also have more or less an Easter egg, not really a pattern, and we have fuzzy matching. So if you don't type in the command correctly, Hytale automatically suggests corrections for the typo. So, hey, unknown command, blah, blah, blah. Did you maybe mean heal? So this is built in. You don't need to do anything. So Hytale uses fuzzy matching on command names automatically. We also have some common mistakes. For example, forgetting required permission. If your problem is if anyone can use admin commands, so you always need to add permissions. It is also very important that you choose the right base class, so it can lead to threading issues or missing data if you choose the wrong base class. You also should use validation, so you can I don't know what the English word is. So we don't have invalid input crashes or corrupt input or something like that. Also, you need to use completable future properly if you don't use base classes like abstract player command, which like sort of hides that away from you. If, like, for example, you do some heavy computation or you call a database and your server would freeze because you are blocking the thread. So it is very important that you choose the right base class. So if you just need to send messages and need no entity component system, use the abstract async command. If you need to modify your own data, use the abstract player command. If you need to modify another player's data, use abstract target player command. If you need to modify any entity, for example, over a Raycast, use abstract target entity command. And if you want to group related commands, use abstract command collection. And those are all base classes I could find. There is one more called abstract world command, which seems to be very important for world operation, or just should make your life a little bit easier. So let's recap this video. So we learned about abstract command collections. We learned about app subcommands. We learned about add usage variants. We learned about command registry. We learned about requires confirmation. We learned about the default arguments, and I've shown you the command alias inside the IntelliJ window because I forgot it to add inside the slide stack. So that's it. Now you know Hytale's command API and you know everything that I know about it. I hope you liked this video. Not the video liked you, but I don't know. I'm not the video. And please leave a like and subscribe, and let's see you again at the next video. Bye bye.